The evening air was warm, the streets nearly empty as Jada walked home from school. It was only a few blocks, but the weight of the day seemed to hang heavy on her shoulders. Her thoughts were scattered, lost in the usual swirl of schoolwork, friends, and the quiet ache of expectations. As the daughter of Denzel Washington, there were days when she felt like she couldn't catch her breath. Everyone looked at her and saw something different, a public figure's daughter, a symbol, a face they recognized, but not the girl underneath. Jada was just a teenager trying to figure it out like everyone else. She tucked her earbuds into her ears, scrolling through her phone as the music beat softly in her ears, letting it drown out the noise of the world. The rhythmic pulse of her favorite song gave her a sense of peace, a fleeting moment where she could forget that she was constantly under scrutiny, that everything she did would be scrutinized by a public that felt entitled to her life. The first flash of blue light startled her from her reverie. A police car was behind her, the siren a faint hum in the distance. It was a typical scene, one Jada had seen countless times before, but today it felt different. Something in the air shifted. She kept walking, hoping the officer would move on. But instead, the car slowed, coming to a stop just behind her. The officer, a tall man with a stern face, leaned out of the window. His gaze seemed to pierce through her, sizing her up. Jada's heart skipped a beat. "You," the officer called out, his voice gruff and commanding. Jada froze, confused. She pulled her earbuds out, heart racing as she turned to face him. "Yes, officer? What's your name?" he barked. "Jada," she replied, trying to remain calm. "I'm just walking home from school." The officer didn't seem to care. He scrutinized her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was a cruel glint in his gaze that made her stomach churn. "You look suspicious," the officer muttered under his breath. "What's a girl like you doing out here, alone?" Jada felt her pulse quicken. She could feel the tension in the air, like a storm that was about to break. She wanted to protest, to explain that she had every right to be on the street, but the officer's posture grew more hostile by the second. He opened the door of his patrol car and stepped out. "I said, what are you doing here?" he demanded again, stepping toward her. Jada instinctively stepped back. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to defuse the situation. She had been taught by her parents, particularly her father, Denzel Washington, to remain calm in the face of injustice. She had learned from his experiences with racism and discrimination. But there was something about this officer, the harshness in his voice, that made her feel small, powerless. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Jada said, trying to keep her voice steady, but there was a tremor in her words. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his large frame looming over her. Without warning, he grabbed her by the arm, yanking her toward him with a rough, violent motion. "Hey, let go of me," Jada cried out, panic rising in her chest. But the officer didn't listen. He tightened his grip on her arm, twisting it behind her back. A sharp, burning pain shot through her body, and she winced, her knees buckling beneath her. "You don't get to walk away from me," the officer sneered, his breath hot on her neck. Jada fought to regain her balance, but the officer's hold was unrelenting. "Please, let me go. You're hurting me." But the officer didn't care. He shoved her against the side of a car, the metal cold against her back. The pain in her arm was unbearable now, a sharp, almost electric sensation. The crowd around them, a small group of pedestrians who had stopped to watch, murmured among themselves, but no one dared to intervene. Jada's mind swam with disbelief. She was used to seeing this on the news, hearing about the injustices that black people faced at the hands of law enforcement. But to experience it firsthand, to feel that unyielding force against her own body, this was something she could never have prepared for. The officer's grip on her arm tightened once more, and that was when she heard it. A loud, sickening crack. Jada screamed in pain. Her arm, it had snapped. Her body went limp, the world around her blurring into a haze of shock and agony. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her broken arm, but the officer didn't let up. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice laced with contempt. Tears welled up in Jada's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was stronger than this. She had to be. Just as everything seemed to spiral out of control, a voice rang out from across the street. "Get your hands off my daughter." Jada's heart leaped into her chest. She knew that voice. It was her father, Denzel Washington. Her vision blurred, but through the tears, she saw her father storming toward them, his face a picture of fury. "Get your hands off her now," Denzel commanded, his voice cold and authoritative. The officer hesitated, but only for a moment. He took a step back, his hands raised in defense. I didn't know, sir," the officer stammered. She was being aggressive. Denzel's gaze was unrelenting as he locked eyes with the officer. "You're lying," he said, his voice filled with quiet rage. "You're lucky she's not pressing charges right now. But you won't get away with this." Jada's vision cleared just enough for her to see her father kneeling beside her. He gently took her hand, his touch reassuring. His presence, the strength he exuded, calmed her heart. She had always admired him, but in that moment, he wasn't just her father. He was a force of nature. The officer stumbled back, clearly caught off guard by Denzel's presence. I didn't mean to," he mumbled, but Denzel wasn't listening. "You didn't mean to? Or did you just not care?" Denzel's words cut through the tension like a knife. The officer took another step back, his eyes darting between Denzel and the crowd. No one moved, but the air was thick with judgment. "We're leaving," Denzel said, his tone final. He helped Jada to her feet, his arm around her as they walked away from the scene. As they made their way to the car, Jada couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of emotions. Anger, fear, and relief. For the first time in her life, she realized the magnitude of what her father had fought for. He had fought for justice, not just for himself, but for all people. And now it was her turn. The emergency room was bustling with activity, but it felt as though Jada existed in a world of her own. Her arm throbbed relentlessly, sending waves of pain up to her shoulder. She was seated on the bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses who worked with practiced efficiency, but their voices barely registered in her mind. She could hear only the rhythmic beeping of the machines, the soft rustling of papers, and the occasional murmur of distant conversations. Denzel was by her side, as he always had been in moments of crisis. His expression was one of restrained calm, but Jada could see the tension in his eyes. He was trying to maintain control, but she knew better. Her father, the man who had faced the harshest of Hollywood's judgment, the one who had stood in front of the cameras and spoken on behalf of those without a voice, was struggling to hide his frustration. "Everything's going to be all right, sweetheart," Denzel said, his voice low, almost a whisper. His hand gently held hers, the warmth of his touch a source of comfort in the midst of the sterile coldness surrounding them. But Jada could barely hear him. Her mind was consumed with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She had always known about racism, how it affected people, how it showed up in the way black people were treated by law enforcement, by society. But now, she had felt it, the sharp sting of unjust treatment, the raw, visceral reality of it. She had been walking home from school, just like any other day. But the second that officer had laid his hands on her, something had shifted inside her. She had tried to reason with him, tried to show him that she was just a teenager, just a girl heading home, but it hadn't mattered. To him, she was just another suspicious black girl. Another person to be controlled, to be put in their place. The pain in her arm was a reminder of what had happened, but the emotional weight was heavier. The questions haunted her mind. Why did it happen? Was it because she was black? Was it because she was young? Was it because she was the daughter of Denzel Washington? Did he think she was above the law, above consequences, just because of who her father was? The nurse came in to adjust her bandages, and Jada winced as the fresh gauze was wrapped around her broken arm. She clenched her jaw, trying not to let the tears spill over. It wasn't the pain that made her want to cry. It was the sheer, suffocating unfairness of it all. Her father's legacy was one of resilience, one of fighting for justice. But in this moment, she felt small. Her father's power couldn't shield her from this, couldn't prevent the officer from seeing her as nothing more than a threat. "You're going to be okay," Denzel repeated, his eyes searching her face for any sign that she was listening. But Jada couldn't find the words to respond. She wasn't sure if she was going to be okay, not in the way he meant. Her arm would heal, but the emotional wound? That was a different story. Later, when they were alone in her hospital room, Jada finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong, Dad," she said, her words thick with frustration. "I was just walking home. I wasn't even doing anything." Denzel paused for a moment, then sighed heavily. He leaned against the edge of her hospital bed, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I know you didn't, sweetheart. But you see, sometimes that's exactly the problem. In their eyes, you don't get the luxury of just being. You're always seen through a lens. And sometimes, that lens is clouded by fear and hatred." Jada's chest tightened. She had heard her father speak about this before, about the way black people were often viewed through prejudiced eyes. She had always understood it in theory, but now it was different. It wasn't just another conversation about the state of the world. It was her world now. She was a part of this fight, this struggle. "I don't want to be the symbol, Dad," Jada said quietly, her eyes fixed on the sterile white walls of the room. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." Her father's gaze softened, and he reached out, cupping her uninjured hand in his. "I know, baby. I know. No one asks for this. But sometimes you have to take what life hands you and make it count. You're not just Denzel Washington's daughter, Jada. You're you. You've got a voice, and now it's time for it to be heard." Jada shook her head slightly, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I'm scared, Dad. I don't know how to fight this. How do I even begin to fix this?" Denzel's expression hardened. "You start by using your voice. You start by speaking out. You don't let them silence you. You use this moment, and you make it matter. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But nothing worth fighting forever is." The door to her hospital room opened then, and a young nurse stepped in, a hesitant smile on her face. "Sorry to interrupt, but you're cleared to go home soon. We just need to do a quick check of your arm, and we'll get you out of here." Denzel nodded and stood, his attention shifting back to the nurse. But Jada's thoughts were still spinning. Fighting. Speaking out. She had seen her father do it for years, but now it was her turn. She wasn't sure what the future held, or what path she would have to walk down, but in this moment, she felt something new stirring inside her. It was a quiet kind of strength, the kind that came from knowing that you didn't have to face the battle alone. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Jada could hear her father on the phone with his lawyer, arranging the next steps. She looked out the window, feeling the weight of what had happened settle on her chest like a stone. She had a broken arm. Yes, but it was so much more than that. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. This was about standing up, about fighting for what was right. Jada wasn't sure how she would do it, but she knew one thing for certain. She would fight. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air, making everything feel colder. The emergency room was crowded, full of people in various states of distress, but to Jada, it felt as though she were in a different world altogether. Her arm was wrapped tightly in bandages, the pain still throbbing through her body in waves. Her focus was scattered, unable to hold on to anything for long. The doctors had told her that the fracture would heal, but nothing they said could stop the sting in her heart, the hollow feeling of injustice. Her father, Denzel, was beside her, as ever a pillar of strength. His calm, authoritative presence seemed to fill the room, and for a brief moment, Jada wondered if he ever truly felt vulnerable. His life had been filled with triumphs, awards, and public admiration, but in this moment, he was simply a father, an unshakable, unwavering presence by her side. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her shame ran deeper than the pain in her arm. What had happened on the street that day, the way the officer had treated her, it was more than just an isolated incident. It was a reminder of everything she had taken for granted. The world was a place where, no matter how accomplished or successful you were still vulnerable to the biases and hatred that ran deep in society. Her father shifted in the chair beside her, his hand resting on her knee, a comforting touch that she could feel even through her tense body. "Jada," Denzel said softly, his voice low but firm, "we're going to make sure this officer is held accountable. And we'll make sure you get justice for what happened." The words should have comforted her, but they only made her feel more isolated. She didn't want justice. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know why people like that officer saw anyone like that. Why was she suddenly an enemy in his eyes? Her father continued, unaware of the storm of thoughts swirling in Jada's mind. This isn't just about you, sweetheart. This is bigger than that. This is a moment we can use, a moment to stand up for what's right. But Jada couldn't connect. She wasn't ready for all of this. She was just a kid, struggling with the weight of her own thoughts, trying to make sense of a world that had shifted beneath her feet. She had always believed in her father's teachings, his stories of activism, and the battles he had fought, both on screen and off. But she had never truly imagined herself as part of the story. Now, her father's words felt like a foreign language, one she didn't fully understand yet. The doctor came in, interrupting her internal turmoil. We've got the x-rays, and it looks like a clean break. We'll need to set it properly, but you should be fine after the healing process. He spoke as though this was just another day on the job, but Jada didn't hear him. She barely registered the words. Once the doctor left, Jada's attention returned to the window. The soft, distant sound of an ambulance siren echoed in the background, blending with the noise of a busy hospital. But for Jada, it felt like the world outside was moving in slow motion. Her father's presence beside her should have been comforting, but it only made her feel more exposed. The sense of vulnerability she had been fighting to suppress now surfaced in full force. "Dad," Jada said quietly, her voice soft, almost tentative, "why does this keep happening? Why do people treat us like we're not human? Like we're something less?" Denzel paused, looking at her carefully, weighing his words. He had spoken out about racial injustice his entire life, but this was different. This wasn't some public speech or interview. This was his daughter, and in that moment, the world seemed a lot less certain. "Because, sweetheart," he began slowly, "some people see blackness as something to fear, something they can control, something they can define by their own narrow views. The reality is, for some, we'll never be seen as equals. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. That doesn't mean we stop standing up for ourselves." Jada didn't know if she understood. The fight her father described seemed so far removed from the quiet life she had led before that day. She had always known that racism existed, but to feel it, to have it manifest so suddenly in a physical attack, it was an experience she wasn't sure how to process. "Why didn't anyone help me, Dad?" Jada asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Why did no one do anything when I was on the ground?" Her father's face softened with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the confusion, the disappointment in humanity. "It's not about you, Jada," Denzel said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of experience. "People are afraid. They don't know how to help. They don't want to get involved, and sometimes they're just as scared as the officer." Jada blinked, tears welling up in her eyes. The thought that those who stood by were just as paralyzed by fear as the officer, that hurt more than the physical pain in her arm. To her, it felt like the world was conspiring to keep people like her small. The silence between them stretched, thick and oppressive. Denzel squeezed her hand gently, and Jada looked up at him, a moment of clarity breaking through her confusion. "Dad, what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Denzel let out a breath, his gaze filled with determination. "Now, we make sure that officer doesn't get away with this. We go to court, we speak the truth, and we make sure your voice is heard. We do it together, and we make sure that this stops here." For a moment, Jada just looked at him, absorbing the magnitude of what he was saying. She had always known that her father had fought for justice. She had seen it in his films, heard it in his interviews, and read it in the books he recommended. But this was different. This wasn't a movie or a story about someone else's struggle. This was real, and it was her life. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay, Dad. I'm with you. Let's fight." As her father stood to make arrangements for their departure, Jada felt something stirring within her. It wasn't the pain from her arm or the dread of facing more battles. It was a quiet, steady resolve. She had no idea what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. She would not let this break her. Not today. Not ever. The next few days passed in a blur. Jada had gone through the motions of her usual routine: school, her father's support, the constant presence of the media, but everything felt different now. The world outside seemed to be in motion, moving at a pace that felt both faster and slower at the same time. There was a sense of urgency, as if everyone was waiting for something. But Jada couldn't shake the sense of isolation. The physical healing was just the beginning, but the emotional scars ran deeper than the fracture in her arm. Jada sat in her bedroom, staring out the window, watching as the city sprawled beneath her. She could hear her father's voice downstairs, discussing legal matters with their lawyer. It had been decided. There would be no retreat, no quiet resolution. They were going to fight. She had never been a stranger to her father's activism. His career had been marked by battles for equality, both in front of the camera and behind it. But this time, it wasn't a role he was playing. This time, it wasn't a scripted moment. This was real, and the fight would take all the strength they had. Jada wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every black person who had been wronged. Every single one who had felt the sharp sting of discrimination and hatred. But the realization that she was now at the heart of this fight made her feel both empowered and terrified. She had to speak, to testify, to expose the reality of what had happened. And as the day of the court hearing drew closer, Jada felt a knot tightening in her chest. Her father came into the room, his footsteps heavy, but his voice light as he sat next to her on the bed. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Jada sighed, her eyes distant. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I'm strong enough." She looked at him, her face conflicted, torn between wanting to fight and fearing the confrontation. Denzel turned to face her, his expression serious but filled with the calm that only he could exude. "Sweetheart," he began, his tone quiet but filled with unshakable conviction, "you're stronger than you think. You've got this. You've always had it in you." Jada shook her head. "But I'm scared, Dad. What if they don't believe me? What if they twist everything and make it sound like I'm the one at fault?" Denzel's gaze softened. "The truth doesn't need to be believed, Jada. It's undeniable. People can try to twist it all they want, but the truth will always stand. It's not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one who speaks with integrity, with honor. That's what matters. Jada bit her lip, a wave of uncertainty rising within her. She had never been so public before. She had always lived in the shadow of her father's fame, his advocacy for justice, but now the spotlight was on her. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Jada and Denzel exchanged a glance before he stood to answer it. It was their lawyer, an older man named Thomas Green, who had worked with them on other legal matters. His presence brought a sense of professional calm, but Jada could feel the gravity of the situation weighing on him too. "Hello, Mr. Green." Jada greeted him as he entered, offering a small, polite smile despite the lump in her throat. "Jada, it's good to see you again," Green said, his voice kind but firm. He set his briefcase down on the table and gave Denzel a respectful nod before sitting down. "We've got a lot to go over. The trial is coming up, and I want to make sure you're as prepared as possible." Jada nodded, her stomach flipping. Her mind was spinning, trying to anticipate the difficult questions she would face, the scrutiny of her every word. But she couldn't back down now. Not when so many others had been silent for so long. Green opened his briefcase and began pulling out a stack of papers. "Here's what we'll be working with. The officer's defense is already trying to paint you as the aggressor, claiming that you were acting out of control." Jada's heart sank as she listened to the details of the defense. They were trying to make it sound as if she had somehow provoked the officer, as if she had been the one at fault. She clenched her fists, her fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. It wasn't just the officer who had hurt her. It was the system that allowed these lies to take hold. It was the same system that allowed the officer to treat her like an enemy when she had done nothing but walk home. Denzel was quick to intervene, his voice cutting through the air with the sharpness of a blade. "We won't let them distort the truth. We'll make sure the world knows what really happened." Green nodded in agreement, his tone professional but empathetic. "That's the plan. Jada, you'll have to testify. And while I believe the truth will come through, I need you to be ready for the difficult questions. They'll try to make you doubt yourself, to make you feel small. But you need to stand tall. They can't break you." Jada swallowed hard. She had heard her father speak about injustice before, but now it was real. It was no longer a theoretical fight. It was her fight. That night, Jada found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in her thoughts. She thought about what her father had said about standing tall. It seemed so simple, yet so impossible. How could she stand tall when her voice felt so small? How could she fight when the world seemed determined to tear her down? The answer, she realized, was not in her strength alone, but in the strength of the people who stood with her. Her father, her family, the community, they were all there, behind her. And with that realization, a sense of purpose started to fill her chest, a quiet determination that grew with each passing minute. The next morning, as Jada prepared for the trial, she stood in front of the mirror, her father by her side. She didn't recognize the person staring back at her, not yet. But she knew that she had no choice but to face the truth. It was her moment to speak, to tell the world that this was wrong, and that no matter how hard they tried to silence her, she would not back down. "I'm ready," Jada said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. Denzel smiled, a proud glint in his eye. "I knew you would be." The courthouse loomed ahead, an imposing structure that seemed to swallow the light. Jada stood at the entrance, her stomach churning with anxiety. The air was thick with the weight of expectation. She could feel the eyes of the world upon her, even though only a few people were gathered outside. Reporters, photographers, and onlookers all waited for something, for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. It was an overwhelming feeling. Jada had spent her life in the public eye, but this was different. This wasn't a red carpet, a movie premiere, or an interview where she could hide behind a carefully crafted persona. This was real. This was her life, her pain, her truth being exposed for everyone to see. Her father, Denzel, stood beside her, his presence a solid foundation in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that threatened to overtake her, but he was steadfast in his belief that she was ready. She had always been strong, always risen above the challenges she had faced. Today, that strength would be tested in ways she had never imagined. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low but comforting. Jada nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I have to do this." Denzel smiled softly and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already done the hardest part, Jada. You've already made the decision to stand up. That's more than most people ever do." The doors to the courthouse swung open, and the flood of reporters pushed forward, eager to get a shot of the Washingtons as they entered. Jada felt the weight of the cameras on her, but she tried to ignore them. She had no choice but to walk through those doors, to take her place in that courtroom, and speak her truth. Inside, the atmosphere was somber, the tension palpable. The defense team was already seated, and the officer, Officer Harris, was sitting at the table, his expression unreadable. Jada couldn't help but notice the faint tension in his posture. He knew what was coming. He knew that this trial would determine not just his future, but the weight of his actions. The judge, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, called the court to order. Jada's heart raced as she took the witness stand. The room felt suffocating, the silence around her almost deafening. Her lawyer, Thomas Green, stood beside her, giving her a reassuring nod. He had been with her through every step of the legal proceedings, providing guidance, support, and expertise. But now it was her turn to speak. Green stood and addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear the truth. My client, Jada Washington, was a young woman walking home from school when she was unjustly accosted and assaulted by Officer Harris. The evidence will show that she was not the aggressor, but a victim of excessive force." Jada felt her breath catch in her throat as she prepared to speak. The weight of the room, the importance of this moment, was overwhelming. She had practiced her testimony over and over, but no amount of preparation could make her feel ready for this. Thomas Green turned to her, his voice gentle. "Jada, would you please tell the jury what happened that day?" Jada took a deep breath and began. The words came slowly at first, but as she spoke, they flowed more freely, each sentence carrying the weight of her experience. "I was walking home from school," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't in a restricted area. I wasn't causing trouble. I was just walking. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The room was silent, all eyes on her. When the officer stopped me, I tried to explain that I was just walking home. I wasn't doing anything to provoke him. But he didn't listen. He grabbed my arm so hard, it felt like he was trying to break it. When I told him to let go, he didn't stop. He twisted my arm behind my back. And then it broke. Her voice cracked at the end, and she quickly wiped her eyes, her throat tightening. But she didn't stop. This was the moment. She couldn't back down now. I couldn't believe it, Jada continued. I couldn't understand why he did it. I couldn't understand why he saw me as a threat, just because of who I am. Her words hung in the air, the room absorbing her pain, her truth. She had never said it out loud like this before, not in such a public way. But here, in this courtroom, it was necessary. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was a story that needed to be heard by everyone. It was a story of injustice, of inequality, of a world where people like her were constantly treated as less than. There was a long pause. Jada's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, but it didn't matter. She had already said what needed to be said. The defense attorney, a tall, well-dressed man, stood up and began his cross-examination. "Miss Washington," he began, his voice smooth but condescending, "you claim that Officer Harris broke your arm, but isn't it true that you were acting aggressively when he approached you? Isn't it true that you refused to comply with his instructions?" Jada stood tall, her chin lifted as she met his gaze. "No, I wasn't being aggressive. I simply asked why he was stopping me. I was asking for answers, but he didn't care about that. He just saw me as a problem." The defense lawyer tried to press her further, but Jada wasn't swayed. She had already spoken her truth, and no one could take that away from her. The questions continued, but Jada was growing stronger with each answer. Her father's words rang in her ears, "You're stronger than you think." She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced by fear, by the system, by the way the world worked. As the questioning ended, Jada sat back in her seat, her body exhausted but her spirit resolute. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had taken a step forward. The jury would deliberate, and the trial would continue. But for now, Jada had done what she set out to do. She had spoken the truth, and that was all that mattered. The days following Jada's testimony were tense. The courtroom had grown colder, the air more oppressive, as both sides prepared for the final moments of the trial. Every time Jada closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the jury, the defense, and the witnesses. It felt like the weight of the world was resting on her shoulders. But there was something else too, something deeper, a sense of justice that had been awakened within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the truth to be heard, for every person who had been silenced, for every voice that had been ignored. But as the trial entered its final stage, Jada began to feel the pressure. The defense was ruthless. They had tried to tear her apart, twisting her words, attempting to paint her as the aggressor, trying to make the jury question her credibility. And yet, she had stood her ground. Her father had been her rock throughout the entire process, but even Denzel, the man who had faced countless battles in his life, seemed weary. He sat beside her in the courtroom, his face unreadable, his eyes focused on the proceedings, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. This was a fight that meant more than just winning or losing. It was a fight for justice. As the last witness took the stand, Jada could feel the tension in the room tighten. It was the officer's turn to testify. Officer Harris had been silent for most of the trial, his defense team doing the talking. But now, it was his moment to speak, and everyone in the room, including Jada, was waiting to hear his side of the story. Harris was a large man, his uniform pressed neatly, his posture stiff and rigid. He had been stoic throughout the trial, his face blank, as if he were completely detached from the events that had transpired. As he took the witness stand, his eyes briefly met Jada's, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. He didn't look sorry. He didn't look remorseful. He looked indignant. "I did what I had to do to protect myself," Harris began, his voice low but firm. "I was just doing my job. When I stopped her, I told her to stay still. But she became agitated. She wouldn't listen to my commands. She was acting suspicious, and I had to restrain her to maintain control of the situation." Jada clenched her jaw as Harris's words rang out in the courtroom. It was as if he was rewriting history, twisting the events to fit his narrative. She knew it wasn't true, but hearing him say it so confidently made her stomach churn. How could he stand there and lie so easily? How could he pretend that he hadn't just been another man acting on his biases? Green, their lawyer, stood and approached the stand. His voice was calm, his questions sharp and deliberate. "Officer Harris," he began, "you're claiming that Jada was acting aggressively, correct?" "That's right," Harris responded, his gaze unwavering. "Then why did you not follow proper procedure when you detained her? Why did you use force so quickly?" Harris faltered for just a moment. I didn't think she would comply. I thought she was going to run, and I needed to ensure she didn't get away." Green pressed on. "You're saying that Jada was a flight risk? That she posed a danger to you?" Harris hesitated. "I didn't know what she was capable of. She seemed threatening." The defense lawyer's eyes narrowed, and he could see that Harris was struggling to maintain his composure. Jada's chest tightened. She could feel the injustice rising inside her, a fire that threatened to overtake her. This man had no remorse. He had no understanding of what he had done. Green's voice broke through her thoughts. "You had no reason to think Jada was a threat. She was a young woman walking home. You were the one who escalated the situation. Isn't that true, Officer Harris?" There was a long pause. The courtroom fell silent as Harris's eyes shifted, his resolve cracking for the first time. His confident exterior seemed to falter as the weight of his actions started to settle in. I was just doing my job," Harris muttered, but his words were barely a whisper now. Green seized the moment, pressing on. "You were not doing your job, officer. You were abusing your power. And because of your actions, an innocent person is hurt." Jada's arm was broken, and for what? For walking home. The room was still as the jury absorbed Green's words. Jada couldn't look at Harris any longer. She was done with him. She was done with the lies, done with the system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. After a few moments of silence, the judge called for a recess, and Jada stood up slowly, her body stiff with the weight of the emotions she had been holding back. She wanted to scream, to yell at Harris for what he had done, but she knew this wasn't the time. The fight wasn't over yet, and she had to remain focused. Outside the courtroom, her father was waiting for her. His face was grave, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "You did well in there," he said quietly. "You stood strong." Jada nodded, but the uncertainty still lingered. The moment was far from over. The defense had tried to paint her as a liar, as someone who had somehow deserved what happened to her. But Jada knew that the truth was on her side. She had spoken her truth, and no matter what happened next, she wouldn't let them silence her. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "This isn't just about today. It's about everything that comes after this. You're making a difference, Jada. You're showing the world what it means to stand up for justice." Jada felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. The words meant more than her father could ever know. The fear and the doubt that had plagued her over the past few days began to subside. She had done her part. The rest was in the hands of the jury. But as she looked out the window of the courthouse, she realized that no matter what the verdict would be, this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The fight for equality, for justice, for the recognition of Black lives, was far from over. And Jada knew, deep in her soul, that she would be at the forefront of that fight for as long as it took. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. Jada sat in her seat, her heart racing. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Today was the day when everything would be decided. Her father, Denzel, sat beside her, his presence as steady as ever, but even he couldn't mask the underlying tension in the room. The final arguments would be made, the jury would deliberate, and the fate of Officer Harris would be in their hands. Jada had spent the night before in turmoil, replaying every moment of the trial in her mind, wondering if she had said enough, if she had been convincing enough. She had spoken her truth, but was it enough to sway the jury? What if they didn't believe her? What if the officer's defense, with all its lies and manipulation, was enough to convince them that she was at fault? But as the doors to the courtroom swung open, she knew that there was no turning back now. She had already given everything she had. Her story was out in the open, and the world was watching. She wasn't just Denzel Washington's daughter anymore. She was Jada, a young woman who had fought for justice. And today, she would either see her fight rewarded or have to accept the bitter reality of a system that had failed her. The judge called the court to order, and both the prosecution and defense stood, ready to make their final statements. Jada could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the jury, the audience, and even Officer Harris, who sat across from her at the defense table. His once confident posture had crumbled. Now, he appeared tense, almost uncertain. His eyes flickered nervously between his attorney and the judge. Jada couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This man, who had once held all the power, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The prosecution was first to speak, and the lawyer, A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Lisa Johnson addressed the jury with clarity and passion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lisa began, her voice commanding attention. "What we have witnessed in this courtroom over the past week is a clear case of abuse of power. Officer Harris, a law enforcement officer sworn to protect the public, took it upon himself to violently accost an innocent young woman. Jada Washington, a teenager, was walking home from school. She was not breaking the law, she was not being aggressive, and she was not a threat. Yet Officer Harris chose to escalate the situation. He chose to treat her like a criminal, to assault her without cause." Lisa's words resonated in the courtroom, the weight of them sinking into every corner. Jada could feel the truth in her bones as Lisa continued. "This case is not just about one officer's actions. It is about the larger problem of systemic racism and the unchecked power that too many people in law enforcement are allowed to wield. Jada was a victim of that system. But today, you have the power to correct that injustice." Jada's heart swelled with pride as Lisa's words echoed in her ears. This was why they had fought. This was why she had stood up, even when it felt impossible. The truth needed to be heard. Officer Harris needed to be held accountable. The defense was next, and Jada could feel her muscles tighten in anticipation. The defense attorney, the same man who had tried to discredit her during her testimony, stood up with a smirk on his face, his confidence unshaken. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," the defense attorney began, "this case is not as clear-cut as the prosecution would have you believe. Yes, Jada Washington may have been a young girl walking home, but that does not excuse her behavior. Officer Harris acted in self-defense, and his actions were entirely justified. The truth is, Jada became combative. She refused to follow commands. She acted suspiciously, and she escalated the situation. Officer Harris had no choice but to use force to ensure that she did not flee." The defense attorney's words twisted the truth, attempting to paint Jada as the aggressor. Jada could feel the anger rising within her as he continued. "It's easy to feel sympathy for someone when you don't understand the full picture. But Officer Harris was doing his job. He had to make a split-second decision in a tense situation, and he made the best choice he could. The prosecution wants you to believe that Officer Harris is some kind of monster, but the reality is far more complicated." Jada clenched her fists under the table, her teeth gritting as the defense attorney spoke. The lies he was spinning were infuriating, but she knew better than to react. She had to stay calm. The jury needed to see through his words. They needed to understand the truth, the whole truth. As the defense finished his statement, the judge called for a recess before the jury would deliberate. Jada stood up, her body aching from the tension that had been building inside her for days. She stepped outside the courtroom, her father following closely behind her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Denzel asked, his voice filled with concern as he walked beside her. Jada nodded, though her emotions were still a whirlwind. "I'm okay. I don't know what to expect. What if they don't believe me, Dad? What if they let him get away with it?" Denzel stopped walking and turned to face her. He placed both hands on her shoulders, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Jada, you've already done something most people will never do. You've stood up for yourself. You've spoken the truth. And no matter what happens in that courtroom, that's something they can't take away from you. You've already won." Jada felt a lump form in her throat. Her father's words were like a balm to her soul, soothing the rawness of the fear and doubt that had been gnawing at her. She had spoken out, and she had done it with the strength and dignity that had been instilled in her. She had faced the injustice head-on, and that alone was a victory. When they returned to the courtroom, the jury was already deliberating. The minutes dragged on like hours, each second stretched out in front of them, each heartbeat louder in the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to their seats. The judge called the court to order, and the moment of reckoning arrived. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge said, her voice calm but firm, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreman of the jury stood, his hands shaking slightly as he held the piece of paper with the verdict. "We have, Your Honor." Jada's heart raced in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The foreman looked at the defense table, then at Jada. "We, the jury, find Officer Harris guilty of excessive force." A wave of relief washed over Jada, so overwhelming that she nearly collapsed into her father's arms. The verdict wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. It was a validation of everything she had endured, everything she had fought for. She had won. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the jury's verdict was read aloud. Jada could barely process the words. Guilty. Officer Harris was guilty of excessive force. The weight of the decision hit her like a tidal wave, washing away the fear, the anger, and the uncertainty that had consumed her for so long. For a moment, she felt as though the room had spun out of control, the faces of the jury, the defense, and even her father blurring into a haze. But then, reality settled in. The officer who had wronged her, who had broken her arm and left her with wounds deeper than she could have imagined, was being held accountable. The justice she had fought for, no, the justice everyone who had been wronged in this system deserved, was finally within reach. Denzel's arm was around her shoulder, steadying her as she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She looked at him, her father, her rock, and she saw the pride in his eyes. He had been with her every step of the way. They had done this together. "I told you, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice filled with warmth. "This is just the beginning." Jada nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had spoken her truth. She had stood tall, even when it seemed impossible. And now, the world had heard her. As the proceedings continued, the judge spoke, explaining the consequences of the verdict. Officer Harris would be placed on administrative leave, his future uncertain. But more than the legal ramifications, this moment was a symbolic victory. It was a step toward justice, not just for Jada, but for every person who had been treated unfairly by a system that was supposed to protect them. It was a victory for the unheard voices, the ones who had been silenced for too long. When the courtroom was finally dismissed, Jada stood with her father, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The cameras outside were still flashing, the reporters eager to catch every word. But this time, Jada didn't feel the usual pressure. This wasn't just about being the daughter of a famous actor anymore. This was about being a part of something much larger than herself. She was a part of a movement for justice, a movement that had only just begun. As they stepped outside the courthouse, the bright sunlight hit Jada's face, momentarily blinding her. She squinted against the light, and for a moment, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something bigger than she could fully comprehend. The fight for justice didn't end with the trial. This was just one battle in a war that had been fought for generations. But today, she had played her part. Denzel squeezed her hand. What you did today, it matters. You matter. Jada glanced at her father, his words resonating deep within her. She had always admired him for his courage, for the way he used his platform to make a difference. But now, she realized that courage wasn't something that could only be found in the spotlight. It was in the quiet moments, the ones when you stood up, even when it seemed impossible. It was in the willingness to speak the truth, no matter the cost. We all matter, Jada said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. We all deserve justice. The two of them walked in silence for a moment, the sound of distant cars and people filling the air. But for Jada, it was as if everything had slowed down. The world felt different now, more connected, more alive. She had done her part, but the work wasn't over. She had always known. The world was unjust, but now she saw it for what it truly was. It wasn't a distant, abstract issue anymore. It was real. It was personal. As they reached the car, Denzel paused and turned to her. You're ready for what comes next. You found your voice, Jada. And now, it's time to use it. Jada nodded, a sense of resolve settling in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would keep fighting. For herself, for the people who had come before her, and for the generations that would follow. The battle was far from over, but today they had won something. And with that victory, they had rewritten the story.